Moraina, tēnā koutou, ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Ko Anna Rawlings taku ingoa, ko o te tiamana o te komihana to hoko hoko. Good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for being here bright and early this morning. I'm Anna Rawlings, I'm Chair of the Commerce Commission, and joining me today is Commissioner Dr. John Small, who will join me after a short presentation to answer questions. As you know, in November 2020, the government asked us to look into the state of competition in the grocery sector in New Zealand. We were to ask whether competition is working well, and if not, what could be done to improve it. During the past 15 months, we've spoken with interested parties in the sector, and we've received a range of information, and a range of suppliers have responded to a supplier survey that we've conducted. We surveyed over 12,000 consumers to find out their views about the grocery sector, and we engaged experts to assist us with focused work relating to consumer preferences and consumer behaviour in a retail context. In our draft report last July, we presented our initial findings and we identified a range of options for recommendations to improve competition. We've consulted on those draft findings, we've considered a vast range of submissions, and we've gathered and considered some very valuable feedback and tested the options for recommendations that we raised. We received submissions on the draft report from over 90 submitters. We hosted an online stakeholder conference and an online hui Māori. We heard from a wide range of individuals and organisations. We heard about factors affecting competition, but we also heard about the importance of kai and its contribution to wellbeing for Māori, but indeed for all New Zealanders. I want to reiterate at the outset our appreciation for the contributions of all who have provided us with their time and information for this market study, particularly against the changing backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that maintaining the resilience and the stability of the grocery sector has been at the forefront of the minds of many for many challenging months, and in particular those of the major grocery retailers. So now to our final findings and our recommendations. None of us is a stranger to grocery shopping, of course. The retail grocery sector is made up of a range of retailers that cater to a diverse range of consumer preferences. Prominent in the sector, though, as we know, are two major operators of supermarket chains. They are Woolworths New Zealand, which has the retail banners Countdown, Super Value and Fresh Choice, and also Foodstuffs, which has the Pack and Save, New World, Foursquare, Raywood Fresh and On the Spot banners. The sector also offers a mix of other grocery retailers, including supermarkets, specialist and international food stores, convenience stores, online grocery retailers and also meal kit providers. As we said in our draft report, in competition terms, we consider that the retail grocery sector can best be described as a duopoly with a fringe of other retailers. Our market share estimates show that the major grocery retailers have a combined national market share of at least 70 to 80%. Our work suggests that they have a combined market share of more than 90% for what consumers characterise as their main shop. And they have more than 80% for their smaller or top-up shops or secondary shopping missions. And other evidence suggests that the major grocery retailers also really only consider each other when they're making material decisions about price and about their retail offerings and about new stores. Our key finding from the draft report remains unchanged. Competition in this sector is not working well for consumers. Foodstuffs and Woolworths are uniquely placed to provide consumers with what we know matters to them most. And that is a wide range of groceries at locations that they can easily access, both in-store and online, and at prices which are generally lower than the prices that are available to consumers in other locations. This enables the major grocery retailers to offer the convenience of one-stop shopping, no matter what the shopping mission is that the consumer is on. Put another way, whether we want just a few things or we want a large weekly shop, consumers know that a Foodstuffs or a Woolworths supermarket will best meet their needs on both convenience and on price. This means that the increasingly diverse range of other retailers at the fringe, including meal kit providers and online providers, while they offer consumers an attractive array of differentiated options, they're unable to compete effectively for consumers' grocery spend on the whole. In addition, while the major grocery retailers compete with one another on many levels, we've found that the intensity of competition between them is muted, and there are weak incentives to engage in stronger competition than we are currently seeing. We've concluded that the key issue affecting competition is that competitors wanting to enter the market or expand face significant challenges in doing that. First, they struggle to secure retail sites for development, and that's due to some planning constraints and restrictive covenants on land and on leases. Secondly, they have difficulties in sourcing the wholesale supply of groceries at prices that enable them to compete with the major grocery retailers. In addition, for many suppliers, there are limited alternatives to supplying foodstuffs and Woolworths. Imbalances in bargaining power and negotiating position result, and this enables the major grocery retailers to shift costs and risks and require acceptance of uncertain terms of trade by suppliers, and this reduces the transparency of the terms available to them. It also limits the willingness of suppliers to supply others who may be looking to enter or expand in the market to compete with the major grocery retailers. We've also found that the major grocery retailers' pricing strategies, promotions and loyalty programs make it difficult for consumers to make informed purchasing decisions, and that impacts their ability to impact competition in turn. Finally, in addition to looking at the conditions for competition that I've described, we consider a range of observable market outcomes that provide insight into the state of competition when we conduct a market study. All of these things together contribute to our overall assessment of whether competition is working well, and if it isn't, what can be done to improve it. On this front, we've concluded that grocery prices appear comparatively high compared with international standards. There are some very positive innovations in the sector responding to consumer demand, and those have benefited consumers, but nevertheless the level of innovation that we observe is less than we would expect in a workably competitive sector. In addition, the profitability of the major grocery retailers appears higher than expected for a period of at least 5 years prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I want to pause here to make a couple of observations about our assessments of profitability, because that can receive a lot of attention and has done following our draft report. Our approach to assessing the profitability of the major grocery retailers has been modified since our draft report in response to submissions and in response to information that we received during our consultation phase that wasn't available to us when we published our draft report. This has had the effect of reducing our assessment of profitability for the major grocery retailers, but our estimates of returns are still higher than we would expect of a normal return for grocery retailing in New Zealand. And now I want to talk about our recommendations. When competition is working well, we know that retailers face stronger pressures to deliver the right prices, the right quality and the right range of groceries to New Zealand consumers. It's this process of workable competition that we're looking for when we undertake a market study and when we assess our recommendations. In our final report, we've recommended a set of changes and new regulatory measures that we think will improve competition in the sector. We've also recommended a dispute resolution scheme and the introduction of a grocery sector regulator responsible for sector monitoring and for oversight to help ensure that those changes have the desired effect. Our recommendations can be grouped into 4 main areas. First, we've recommended measures to improve the conditions for new retailers to enter this sector and for existing retailers to expand. Second, we've recommended measures that will help to improve the relationships that suppliers have with grocery retailers. Third, we've recommended measures to help consumers to improve competition by making informed decisions. And we've recommended a range of other measures to support and incentivise compliance with these recommended regulatory measures, including the regulator that I've mentioned and the dispute resolution scheme also. We've made high-level judgments about the potential costs and benefits of our recommendations, and we consider that they are likely to improve competition, they're also feasible, and they're proportionate to address the factors affecting competition that we have identified. Given what I've said about the factors affecting competition, it comes as no surprise that we consider that the best way to improve competition is through measures that are likely to improve conditions for entry and expansion. In particular, what we're looking for is the enablement of a range of grocery retailers that can offer consumers a convenient and price-competitive one-stop shopping option, no matter what the mission that they are on. The key measures that we recommend for improving the conditions for entry and expansion are the freeing up of sites for development for retail stores and improving access to groceries for resale. To free up sites for development, first we recommend taking steps to make land more available for new stores under planning law. In our view, the current review of the resource management system provides a real opportunity to consider the extent to which the planning process can take into account greater prominence for competition. We recommend improving the availability of sites by specifically planning and providing for grocery retailing, and also increasing the scope to consider the benefits of competition when making planning decisions. Second, we recommend banning restrictive covenants on land. Those are promises not to do something that follow the land. And exclusivity covenants in leases, covenants that prevent another grocery retailer from setting up in specific locations such as a shopping centre or similar. Limited scope for pro-competitive authorisation of these things might be possible. But both types of restricted covenants prevent retail grocery stores from being developed in specific locations, and this is affecting competition. These are practices that the major grocery retailers have indicated publicly that they're willing to address. However, we think that an enduring solution is needed beyond voluntary commitments alone. Enforcement of these prohibitions needs to be built into legislation, in our view. The second suite of recommendations that we make is directed to improving access to groceries for resale. To this end, we recommend a regulatory regime that governs wholesale supply by the major grocery retailers to other retailers who are looking to access wholesale groceries for on sale to consumers. The major grocery retailers would be required to clearly describe the procedures and the criteria that they will use when they consider requests for supply by competitors. They also would be required to provide clear and transparent terms and conditions of supply, or clearly explain the principles that they'll apply when negotiating terms and conditions for supply. Within that framework, they'll be required to consider all requests for wholesale supply in good faith and in compliance with those processes and criteria that they've established themselves. We also recommend an information and disclosure regime and the grocery sector regulator and dispute resolution schemes that I've mentioned to help support the implementation and the effectiveness of these initiatives. For example, information about requests for supply that have been received and whether they've been granted or not, together with the terms and conditions for supply, would be shared with the grocery regulator on a regular basis for monitoring purposes. This is a recommendation for wholesale supply by the major grocery retailers, supported by a set of mandatory supply requirements relating to their conduct as wholesale suppliers. In practice, they wouldn't have to supply competing retailers, and the price at which they supply would not be regulated. It will be up to the parties to negotiate those prices. But the major grocery retailers will be accountable for considering requests in good faith and for being clear and transparent about the processes and criteria and the terms and conditions under which they supply others. We raised in our draft report, and we've considered other options such as a fully regulated wholesale access regime and the separation of major grocery retailers' businesses in a way that requires their wholesale business to be run separately from their retail businesses. Some submitters and commentators favoured this approach and others did not. We do not recommend these additional steps. These options would be highly complex to develop and they would be unprecedented in our view. As similar regimes of this nature tend to take place only when dealing with a monopoly business and with many less differentiated products and less differentiated supply. In any event, and perhaps more importantly, we also consider that there is likely to be insufficient demand to sustain an independent wholesaler over the longer term. And that's for a range of reasons which I want to go through. First, we consider that the major grocery retailers, of course, would be highly unlikely to make use of independent wholesale due to their preference, as they currently run their businesses, for vertical integration. That is, for running their own wholesale and retail operations out of a single business. This appears to create some real efficiency benefits. While independent wholesale supply might be used by new or growing large grocery retailers on a short or medium-term basis, for the same efficiency reasons, after establishing a foothold, we consider that those large-scale rivals are also likely to shift to building their own relationships with suppliers and a model of vertical integration. Smaller independent retailers would benefit from independent wholesale supply on an ongoing basis. But we've concluded that it's unlikely that they alone would provide sufficient demand to support the scale of an independent grocery retailer over the longer term. In our view, as well as these reasons relating to limited sustainable demand, we also believe that requiring the formal separation of the major grocery retailers' businesses could have a range of negative impacts on efficiency. And this has led us to focus on commercial wholesale supply by the existing major grocery retailers, supported by a regulatory regime that would require them to consider that supply in good faith and prescribe requirements for clear and transparent disclosure of the way that they intend to go about that. The major grocery retailers have indicated a degree of willingness to explore commercial wholesale supply during our study, but we consider that these regulatory mechanisms are required to incentivise efficient supply and also to ensure compliance through a combination of monitoring, enforcement and dispute resolution. In addition to improving the availability of suitable grocery retail sites and wholesale supply, we identify other regulatory factors affecting competition that could be considered next time legislation is reviewed, and these relate to overseas investment and the sale and supply of liquor. We also suggest continuing to monitor the strategic conduct of the major grocery retailers, such as the use of best price clauses and exclusive supply agreements entered into by them, that may prevent another grocery retailer from obtaining supply easily or obtaining supply at competitive prices. We also consider that competition will be improved if the relationships between the major grocery retailers and suppliers are rebalanced in order to improve suppliers' positions in their dealings with the major grocery retailers. For this reason, the third suite of recommendations that we make relates to supporting suppliers in their dealings with those major grocery retailers. We recommend the introduction of a compulsory or mandatory code of conduct for grocery supply arrangements. Disputes about compliance with the code would be resolved by the dispute resolution scheme that I've mentioned, and the grocery regulator would also have responsibility for monitoring and oversight of that code of conduct. The key components of the code would include, again, an overarching duty of good faith dealing, but also measures to improve the transparency of supply arrangements and written agreements, some restrictions or prohibitions on some types of conduct that we've heard about in the course of our study, and enforcement and dispute resolution processes. We also recommend further consideration of review of the Fair Trading Act to strengthen the prohibitions against unfair standard contract terms, and we also recommend considering enabling collective bargaining on behalf of suppliers through legislation. Finally, we've observed that consumers play a very important role in ensuring that competition is effective, and we recommend a range of measures to support their role as informed decision makers supporting competition in the sector. We also recommend introducing mandatory unit pricing to require all grocery retailers to consistently display prices using standard units of measurement so that consumers can more easily make comparisons between prices and also between stores. We encourage the major grocery retailers to follow through on their signalled intentions to ensure that their promotional and pricing practices don't create consumer confusion, and also to make sure that their loyalty term program terms and conditions are easy for consumers to understand. It's particularly important that consumers can understand and compare the benefits that are offered to them by loyalty programs by way of rewards, and also the ways in which loyalty programs collect and use their personal data and information. And finally, while there's mixed evidence about the prevalence and utility of price comparison services, we also recommend that the major grocery retailers cooperate with any price comparison service interested in gathering pricing information for the purpose of providing that service to consumers. As you can see, our recommendations are directed at improving conditions for competition through a range of initiatives. A number of recommendations that relate to planning and to legislative change will require further consideration by local and by central government. The Commission might have a role in relation to the enforcement of some initiatives if they're adopted, such as changes to unfair contract terms regimes, as well as prohibiting the use of restrictive covenants and mandating unit pricing, if those things are introduced through the Fair Trading Act and the Commerce Act. In addition, the major grocery retailers, as I've mentioned, have indicated that they will address some initiatives themselves to improve the information that's made available to consumers and to reconsider the use of restrictive covenants. Following this report, of course, they may also take voluntary steps to implement others of the recommendations that we've made. But as I've mentioned already a couple of times, we also recommend the establishment of a dedicated grocery sector regulator and a new dispute resolution scheme to support the implementation of the regulatory measures that I've talked about. A dispute resolution scheme would resolve disputes relating to supply contracts and also wholesale supply contracts and also supplier relationships where those suppliers are dealing with grocery retailers under the code. The grocery sector regulator would also be responsible for general sector oversight and monitoring. It would report both publicly and to government on a regular basis about sector performance, and its specific functions would be a matter for government to decide upon in considering our recommendations. But these could include oversight of the full range of recommendations that we've made, including those that might be adopted through sector-specific regulation rather than amendments to legislation such as the Fair Trading Act or the Commerce Act. The regulator would also have robust information gathering powers to enable it to discharge its monitoring functions. In addition, we recommend consideration is given to an information disclosure regime which would ensure that specified retailers collected and disclosed information about particular things in a particular format on a regular basis. That information would support the regulator in its monitoring and oversight functions, but it would also inform a review of industry performance that we recommend takes place about 3 years after the government has implemented any reforms that it chooses to implement. We believe that these are the right set of recommendations to operate in an interrelated way to provide a meaningful improvement to the conditions for competition in the New Zealand grocery sector. But at the 3-year point, it would make sense to take another look and evaluate the effectiveness of those changes in improving competition to see if they are having the effect that we expect that they will have. If competition isn't working as well as it could at that time, then additional initiatives may be appropriate to address the observed conditions for competition in the market at that time. This market study has been a journey through some difficult challenges faced by New Zealand and faced by the New Zealand grocery sector. Nevertheless, we've been pleased to conclude this comprehensive piece of research and a comprehensive consultation process that added real value to our draft report and enabled us to reach these final recommendations. The initiation of the study has brought an increased focus to the sector, leading to some of the focuses of attention by the major grocery retailers on some of the signalled changes to conduct that I've identified this morning. And now we're pleased to have arrived at a set of recommendations and initiatives that we believe are appropriate to respond to current market conditions. We presented our final report to the Minister, and now it will be for Government to, of course, consider our findings and recommendations in more detail before deciding whether they will be implemented or in what form. Now we're happy to take questions.
I feel like a back down to you.
What sort of back down?
Well, the interim report was major structural change, now it's sort of various forms of regulation.
The draft report raised a range of options for recommendations to consider for the final report. It didn't suggest any particular course of action, and in fact a number of the courses of action would have been inconsistent with one another. The nature of the consultation process was to test those options along with our findings and to arrive at a final set of recommendations that we thought was appropriate, and that's the task that we've discharged.
So saying that you thought the problem was structural, was that tactical to flush out the supermarket?
What we said was that we thought competition wasn't working well and something needed to be done to improve the ability for others to enter and expand under improved conditions for competition. All of those options related to that finding. Our finding is unchanged. We still consider that competition isn't working well, and we think that the best way to improve conditions for competition is to enable still the entry and expansion of others within the sector by freeing up land for development and by providing some further wholesale access to grocery supply.
If the government did adopt all the recommendations that you set out today, can you say that food prices in New Zealand would come down?
Well, the purpose of the market study, I think we've talked about before, is to look at whether competition is working well. And what we know is that when competition does work well, the retailers are under a greater pressure to deliver the right range of products to consumers at the right prices. But it's ultimately for the market to determine who will be operating in that market and what those prices will be. What we would expect is that if competition was working better than it is now, consumers would pay lower prices for a given range or quality of groceries that they buy today.
The undertone of why the politicians wanted this market study to be done was because they said the price of food was too high. I understand that your focus was on competition, but by increasing competition, are you saying that if the government adopted these recommendations, competition would increase and therefore the price of food would fall?
That is the effect of an improvement in competition, is that we would expect consumers to pay lower prices for a given range or quality of items that they buy today.
You said in July that it was highly unlikely any third major chain would set up in this country without significant intervention. On these measures that you are recommending, are the chances of a third major chain emerging enhanced?
Yes. Yes, they are.
In what way?
Well, there's the two. Look, what we said in July was that we've got a stable duopoly with high barriers to entry. And what we've done here is to say two of those major barriers to entry are things that can be addressed by policy. And they are supply of land for sites, so that's going to be a lot easier. And secondly, wholesale supply of groceries. Both of those things are significant barriers. They're not the only barriers to entry, but they are significant impediments.
Did you at any stage consider there's various suggestions made by some of the smaller interest groups that you should force the divestment of stores from the two major chains?
Yes, so that was an option raised in the draft, and we considered it in the process to reach these final recommendations, of course, and received submissions on it. Underlying consideration of that issue, though, is our view that independent wholesale supply is unlikely to be a long-term sustainable proposition for the reasons I mentioned, that a large rival seeking to enter the market is likely to want to build over time its own supply relationships directly and vertically integrate, run its own supply and retail operations together. And the smaller retailers that might enter and are looking for wholesale supply can be supported by the initiatives that we've recommended and may rely on that wholesale supply over time, but would in aggregate not provide sufficient demand to provide an independent wholesale supply of scale.
But why did you scrap that specific recommendation that was talked about in the interim report? Because that was the one that got all the headlines. It was the
Which one's that? The split, the horizontal split?
Retail divestment.
Yeah. So the reason is essentially that we've located two very fixable, major and significant barriers to entry. What we're saying now is give entrepreneurs and entrants an opportunity to take advantage of those in a more freed up, competitive environment. Let them have a go. And to your point, yes, that will make it easier. It will make it easier for other firms to grow, existing firms to grow, and for new firms to enter.
What's stopping the established players from just swallowing up all the new land that you've made available?
Swallowing up all the new...
Well, we've made recommendations that relate to planning law, which would provide for the consideration of competition in the consideration of planning decisions. And also we recommend the allocation of a volume of land for development in retail. And those planning requirements, as well as our recommendations relating to the use of land covenants and exclusive leases, together we recommend will free up retail sites for development by others.
There's 90 exclusive, 90 of these lease covenants, 60 of which go for 20 years. That's 90 sites that are now going to be available that weren't available when we first started the study. In the case of leases and developments, there's 60 odd leases that have exclusive terms in them. Get rid of those. That's another 60 sites where supermarkets can be developed. That's a significant freeing up of land, which is a key barrier to entry.
Wouldn't it be more effective to go with the divestment option in terms of starting with more of a fair playing field for that new player to come?
Well, what we're looking at are conditions for competition across the board, and we are not satisfied that the benefits to competition that might result from structural remedies of that nature would outweigh the complexities and the costs associated with undertaking these very direct and very involved initiatives, which are largely unprecedented, or actually unprecedented in our view and in our inquiry around the world, in a sector such as this. Our focus has been on ensuring that there is an enduring source of wholesale supply that can capitalise on the economies of scale that are already inherent in the businesses of the major grocery retailers, to enable those who want to seek supply from them to access that supply. That might give rise to a leg up to a new large-scale rival entering the market, or who may, in our view, then look to set up their own vertically integrated business, or it may support a greater degree of competition among those fringe retailers that we've identified to make them more viable competitive constraints on the major grocery retailers. It's not only about a large-scale rival, it's also about assisting that fringe, diverse and changing and evolving fringe of competitors to provide some greater constraint.
What's the feedback from the major chains? One of the main reasons for moving away from the divestment option as well. Did you get strong feedback against that?
I don't think you should say it's moving away from the divestment option. Remember what we put out in the draft report was a set of options, right? So it's what we saw our task as being as to work through that set of options and come up with a package that we thought was going to be appropriate. So it's not, none of them, and as Anna said, some of those were mutually exclusive. So, I don't think you should say it's moving away from anything. It's designing a system that we think has got really good prospects for improving competition in the immediate near term, and we think it's worth giving the market a go.
If this doesn't lead to a third player, if this doesn't lead to a like-for-like third player emerging in the next few years, will the public be, entitled to think that you failed in this market study? Second question, what you've announced on sort of land covenants, they could easily have been dealt with through the Commerce Act, couldn't they? Any anti-competitive nature of any agreements there? The public will perceive the fuel market study to have failed. They're likely to view that you've bottled it on this one.
I think there might be three questions there, so shall I deal with them in turn? First of all, your first question is in 3 years' time, if we haven't seen a single large-scale rival into the market. What we're talking about here is providing some greater conditions for competition for any of those options that I've mentioned earlier. So obviously, a large-scale rival will provide a high degree of competition sooner, potentially, than the growth of those retailers at the fringe. But in fact, what we anticipate happening is the evolution of any of those, all or any of those options. And we've recommended a review for 3 years' time without a firm regulatory backstop of any of these structural remedies that we've been discussing, because we consider that the sector is dynamic. We've received submissions to that effect, and that it's appropriate at that point in time to assess how these measures that may have been implemented by government have taken effect and how the conditions for competition have changed. If further initiatives are required at that time to further improve competition, they may include some of the options that we identified in the draft report, but they will depend upon the conditions of competition at the time, and there may be other measures that are considered to be appropriate as well. I think your next question related to land covenants and the Commerce Act. We do comment on the use of land covenants and exclusivity clauses in relation to the Commerce Act, and specifically what we've identified in relation to this sector is that in order for the Commerce Commission to take enforcement action against these things, we must identify them, we must investigate and take enforcement action in relation to them, and usually only one at a time. What we're recommending here is an initiative that the major grocery retailers have commented upon already, where a sector-wide initiative can be followed to more quickly and more clearly identify that restrictive land use and exclusivity clauses in leases will not be permitted, subject perhaps to some very few pro-competitive exceptions, and that will have a sector-wide effect where our enforcement activity cannot. I think your third question, Tom, related to the fuel market study, which was...
You must be aware that most of our readers perceive this as a big step back from the draft report with very, very little action sort of likely on top of a fuel study which is perceived not to have really delivered any benefits to consumers. So I just wonder if you're concerned about the broader level of public confidence in the work that you do.
I think in relation to fuel, we won't linger on that, it's not the topic for discussion for today, but the Fuel Industry Act has only just come into force in stages in recent months, and our team has been gearing up to implement that Act and the initiatives that it implemented to improve competition. In our view, we are starting to see some effects, but there are, we're also not deaf to the public voice on fuel prices, nor to the global influences on fuel prices either. So competition in this sector as well will take us so far. There will always be other influences like inflation on price, but we're confident that what the market study delivers is a robust review of the state of competition in any particular sector, and it's our role to make recommendations that we think can improve competition in each of these sectors, and then it's for government to determine what it would like to do with the recommendations and what initiatives it might like to implement.
You said that you had, in the course of the study, revised lower your estimation of the financial returns that the chains are making. Does that mean that you do not believe they are making excessive profits now, that they are that the profits and the return on investment are reasonable?
I think I mean the key point here is that we have revised the way in which we went about the exercise, modified it, but our finding is still that those returns on investment are higher than we would expect. And John, I'm sure, can give you a bit more detail.
Yeah, I mean, what we do in profitability assessment normally is we estimate the cost of capital and then we estimate the return on capital, and we compare the two. And our cost of capital estimate hasn't changed very much. It's still about 5.5% per annum after tax. And our estimate of the profitability of the firms, because we've we can talk about the reasons for this in a minute if you like, but our current estimates of profitability are in the range of 13%, so more than twice the cost of capital. So that's still a higher return than you'd expect if competition was working well, quite a lot higher.
In terms of your point that you said in response to Jason's question earlier about putting competition into local planning, are you suggesting then that local council is the best place to be able to tell whether or not a different brand will bring competition to the local space?
No, it's not at all. It's about just enabling a lot more space. So one of the big issues is in a built-up urban environment. Given the current planning constraints, there are often very, very few places where you can build a supermarket. And so what we're suggesting, since there's already a review of the planning framework underway, is to slot into that review 2 or 3 critical provisions that will, if enacted, require local councils, actually require them to enable enough land that there's choice of sites, not that you can maybe find one, but that there's several that you can choose from. And they don't get to choose who builds them, they just enable the space. So then whoever wants those sites can build on them and make it, and that's the way it works.
I think it targets really 3 areas. One is ensuring that there is enough land available through planning itself. The second is in looking at limiting controls by making grocery perhaps a permitted or a controlled activity and not so much a discretionary activity. And the third relates to the extent to which you can take into account competition, not the arguments of individuals, which have been a subject of discussion in the past, where one trade competitor can seek to block consent to serve their own interests, but where you can take into account to a greater extent the need for competition and the benefits to consumers that can accrue for that through this planning decision making.
Just before you said, not getting that, but I'm just kind of wondering though, that in terms of that, what about what you just said would allow a new entrant who doesn't have decades of experience in a local space? What would give them an advantage over the 2 existing incumbents to build stores?
Well, what would give them the advantage is the ability of the planning process to take into account the benefit that would accrue from competition in a particular location, rather than the consenting of additional stores by incumbents in a geographical area. That's effectively that competition element. Jason?
Yeah, just before, and correct me if I'm off the mark here, you said you estimated profitability would be about 13%. It was my understanding that given the fact that the government gave you the power to be able to probe these industries, you would be relying on not just estimations, but you'd be physically getting the data from them. So does this suggest that... No?
No.
Well, no, the answer is yes. I think that, so what we do when we undertake a market study is we look at a range of factors affecting competition that I've described, particularly here entry and expansion conditions, but we also look at a range of observable outcomes, and profitability is one, but it is just one of those conditions of competition observable outcomes, first of all, that we have regard to, and these things together go in the round to contribute to our assessment that competition is not working as well as it could here. But in the assessment of profitability itself, there is a large volume of information received by the Commission, and there is a lot of rigorous work undertaken by people on that particular work, and much of it appears actually in the appendices to the report. So it's not a broad estimation, it's the result of work undertaken on that particular work stream.
It's a measure, if you prefer to think of it as a measure of our measure of competition, our measure of their profitability. They will have a different measure because they will treat different things in different ways, but this is our measure. We call it an estimate because there are a lot of assumptions that are required to get to calculate that, but it's based, as Anna says, on a huge amount of information that we sourced from them.
Sure. Given that, how would you rate the major retail grocery stores' cooperations with you during this market study?
They've been extremely cooperative with the market study, and we have no no complaint whatsoever with the engagement that we've had from them and from many others in the sector as well. And there have been a contribution, I think, to an earlier question about whether the views of the major grocery retailers really strongly influenced our ultimate findings. Of course they are an influence. They are the most affected by some of these findings. But we received information from a large number of submitters. I think I mentioned over 90, many after the draft report that we had not heard from before the draft report, despite our best efforts. And there are a number of different voices in that stakeholder group as well, and through those submissions. And we've taken into account what all of them had to say in reaching the findings that we've reached.
With the measures that you are proposing, how realistic do you think it is that we will see a major rival in New Zealand in the coming years?
We think wholesale supply in particular could provide a leg up to a major rival who otherwise would be finding it difficult to set out in this sector because they can't find that wholesale supply to supplement their direct relationships with suppliers whilst they build them over time. And that's particularly in the area of dry grocery supply. And as John mentioned, also there are a number of sites that we think could be made available with the removal of restrictive covenants and exclusivity provisions in leases, which might see, for example, more than one grocery retailer in a mall in some cases, and may also free up sites through those planning changes to enable land to be accessed for what are very large-scale stores.
You talked in the recommendations about making that wholesale supply relationship, more regulated. But when it is based on competition and we currently have a duopoly, how realistic is it that they would be helping enable a rival to thrive?
Well, because what we've recommended is a set of obligations that would be regulated, if you like, with which they'll have to comply. And a cornerstone of those obligations, and the obligations contained in the Code of Conduct also, are obligations of good faith and fair dealing, if you like, for want of a better phrase, which apply in many other areas as well. And they will be visible and reported upon to a grocery sector regulator who will have a specific focus in this sector. And that's an initiative that has been employed with some success overseas as well.
Can you just briefly summarise what you mean with, a new rival comes, they're still building up these enduring relationships, but one of the existing chains would prop them up with some supplies that they need? How does that work, just for our audience to understand what you mean a bit?
That is essentially how it would work. If we talk about a large-scale rival who may be brand new to New Zealand, they would be looking to set up business in New Zealand, and they would need places to do that. So our focus on the availability of sites for retail development is targeting that. Where can they build a new supermarket if they're a large-scale grocery retailer that can compete with the incumbent supermarkets? The second, though, is what are they going to sell in that supermarket? Where are they going to acquire those groceries? And this will provide an opportunity for them to acquire those groceries at prices that enable them to compete, which is a key part of the element. They don't have to go to Pack and Save and try to stock their store like many corner stores are doing at the moment. They can go direct to the major grocery retailers to obtain wholesale supply at prices that enable them to compete effectively, whilst at the same time they look to set up their own direct supply relationship with suppliers who feel more confident and able to do that because a supplier code of conduct is protecting their interests in relation to the major grocery retailers. Many of them reported to us that they feel hesitant or afraid to supply a competitor because they're worried about what that might mean for their relationship with the major grocery retailer. Over time, though, our key finding in relation to wholesale supply is that we think that that major rival in particular would look to move away from wholesale supply from effectively its competitors to establish a vertically integrated business of its own where it's got direct relationships with suppliers, providing its own wholesale supply to its own series of retail stores. And this is a key reason why we consider that independent wholesale supply, wholly independent wholesale supply, whether set up on its own or whether separated out from the major grocery retailers as they are at the moment, which is something that was discussed in the draft report, is unlikely to be successful in the long term.
Are you suggesting supermarkets have to take part in this? legislated regulation scheme of supply?
The regime that relates to the way in which they would go about wholesale supply would be a regulated regime. Once they receive requests for supply, it will govern the way in which they consider those requests. But like any commercial relationship, the terms and conditions upon which they actually supply will always be governed by the commercial realities of the situation itself.
David Clark says, from today we will immediately progress work to address the Commission's recommendations. Are you pleased to see that essentially it looks like all the recommendations have been accepted?
Well, we aim to make recommendations that we consider are feasible and will have the desired effect and improvement in competition, and we make them for that purpose, and it's for government to decide what to do with them. But we're confident that they will have an effect on competition that benefits New Zealand consumers.
Can you talk us through the quite dramatic revision lower in profitability expectations? Did you simply get it wrong? You seem to be doing it a different way until you were well advanced in the process.
We might take that offline,
Yeah,
shall
sure.
we? I wonder if...
Talk about that after, if you like.
What have we got time for just
Just one more? Yeah.
I had one.
Yes.
You mentioned the obligations of good faith being successfully implemented overseas. I'm wondering where and what success kind of looked like in those cases.
So supplier codes of conduct are, apply in the UK and in Australia with a similar type of framework to the framework that we are recommending here. And in fact, we favour the Australian code most likely as being readily applicable here, but the detail, there's a fair degree of detail about the nature of the code in the final chapter of the report relating to recommendations.
Thank you, everybody.